This session is on Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. At the 15th National Conference, the 28th Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, delivering the Neville Bonner oration, called on ACM as the, quote, fiercest defenders of the Constitution to set aside scepticism and to support the constitutional recognition of the Indigenous people. As a consequence, we made a detailed submission to the Parliamentary Committee on the subject. In this, we called for the involvement of the people from the beginning and not just to the end through an elected, appointed and unpaid convention, holding most of its meetings electronically to save costs, and discussing this and other important constitutional subjects. This panel then is a continuation of the earlier one in which Tony Abbott encouraged us to raise this issue. And on this occasion, we will hear first from Keith Windschuttle on his new book, and then proceed to a panel discussion. When Keith has completed, I will then introduce the panel so the names will be fresh in your minds. Keith Windschuttle.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for the invitation to come here. It's a great honour to speak at this distinguished gathering. Now, the recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution has a hidden agenda that so far no one has wanted to discuss. Now, on the one hand, our political leaders believe recognition will contribute to national reconciliation, that it will finally bring Aboriginal people into the political fold and will acknowledge their proper place in the nation. In 2013, opposition leader Tony Abbott argued, I'm quoting him, "We have never fully made peace with the first Australians. Until we have acknowledged that, we will be an incomplete nation and a torn people." As Prime Minister a year later, and let me make it clear where my loyalties in this debate lie, as Prime Minister a year later, a Prime Ministership that in my view may well go down as one of the shortest, but also as one of the greatest periods of Prime Ministership this country has seen. Mr Abbott said his objective in holding a referendum was not to change the Constitution but to complete it so we can make our country whole. But on the other hand, while he was saying this, when members of the Aboriginal political class discussed this issue amongst themselves and in books, academic papers and in speeches to Aboriginal conferences, they took a quite different view. And they haven't been saying their aim is to make the Constitution complete or the nation whole. They don't say, indeed, ever since their success in gaining native title in 1992, they have sought to go one big step further. As well as getting their land back, they now want to get their country back too. As the title of a recent book by Aboriginal authors Marcia Langton and Megan Davis says, it's our country, and that's their emphasis on the cover. To these activists, recognition of Aborigines in the Constitution would simply be one more step towards their real objectives: political autonomy, traditional law and values, and sovereignty of their own separate state or nation. They say that they see themselves as First Peoples whose ancestral status gives them ownership and jurisdiction over Aboriginal land. They do not regard the Australian nation as their true country. They describe the Australian nation as no more than a recently arrived, quote, settler state, whose rule, according to Aboriginal filmmaker Rachel Perkins, they have endured with a burning resentment ever since 1788. Now, the concept of sovereignty has been absent from the mainstream media's reporting of constitutional recognition, but it's long been the principal objective of the Aboriginal political class, and that's the Aboriginal political class right across the spectrum, from gradual reformists to radical agitators. They argue that because Aborigines never ceded sovereignty in the colonial era, because they signed no treaties and were never actually conquered, as the first landowners, they remain the continent's sovereign people. And they claim that in restoring land rights in the Mabo decision, Australian courts recognised that traditional Aboriginal society was governed by its own laws. The existence of a legal system, they argue, logically entails the existence of Aboriginal sovereignty, which was supposedly never extinguished by the British Crown's own Declaration of Sovereignty under James Cook in 1770. Now, there's nothing new about this demand for sovereignty. The concept dates back to the 1970s and to the Aboriginal Treaty Committee, a body of white Canberra activists led by former Reserve Bank Governor and federal and advisor to Chifley and Menzies governments, Nugget Coombs. This committee looked forward to the day when an independent Aboriginal government, or governments, could stand alongside state and territory governments before the Commonwealth Grants Commission, which is now COAG, in their own right. Since then, all major government-funded federal bodies of Aboriginal people have supported that objective, from the National Aboriginal Conference in 1982, which declared, quoting, "In pursuing the Makarrata, or treaty, we assert our basic rights as sovereign Aboriginal nations which are equal in status with the Commonwealth of Australia," unquote. Up to 2012, when a survey by the current National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, which is the successor to ATSIC, found 88% of its members identified constitutional recognition and sovereignty as the top priority of Aboriginal people. The objective of the Aboriginal political class is that once a vaguely worded constitutional referendum was passed recognising their prior occupation of the continent, they would be able to argue successfully for sovereign status before a friendly High Court, headed by a sympathetic Chief Justice like the current Robert French. Where would their sovereign nation be located? Well, the more optimistic members of the Aboriginal political class, like Michael Mansell, believe it might be possible to unite all the land now held under native title into one almost continuous state stretching from Gippsland all the way to the Pilbara and the Kimberley. Other activists, such as Noel Pearson, are less ambitious, but they talk in terms of a number of Aboriginal states based mostly on the territories now controlled by Aboriginal land councils. And Warren Mundine agrees. He advances a strategy to recognise existing Aboriginal clan associations and language groups as, quote, First Nations, with the Commonwealth making separate agreements or treaties with each one. How much land would a black state have? According to the National Native Title Tribunal, as at the 31st of March 2016, no less than 30.4% of the Australian continent is already held under native title. Once all the claims before the Native Title Tribunal are processed, well, that's the ones currently under determination, this will add another 31.7% of the continent to native title. In other words, all up, native title will soon amount to more than 60% of the Australian continent. And in my book on the subject, I've reproduced in both the end papers, the front and the back of the book, the map by the Native Title Tribunal, which shows exactly how much land we would all be left with after that. What this means is that the 140,000 people now living on traditional Aboriginal lands will be the owners of 60% of the entire continent, with the remaining 24 million of us left with less than 40%. Now, if it was to be put to the Australian people in a referendum that sovereignty over this much of Australia was the outcome Aborigines want from constitutional recognition, the chances of it passing would be slim, to say the least. But of course, it's not being promoted that way. For example, the Recognize website of the government-funded body Reconciliation Australia quotes an article by Galawai Yanapingo, which was published in 2009, saying he wanted constitutional recognition, quote, to bring my people in from the cold, to bring us into the nation, unquote. Now, it's true he did say that in that article, but in the same article, he also wrote something more definitive about his objectives. I'll quote him. the lands of East Arnhem Land join me in acknowledging no king, no queen, no church and no state. Our allegiance is to each other, to our land and to the ceremonies that define us. These ceremonies record and pass on the laws that give us ownership of the land and of the seas and of the rules by which we live," unquote. Now, the Recognize campaign quotes that part of Yunupingu's article saying he wants to bring his people in from the cold, but completely omits his statement that he does not recognise the Australian Queen, the Australian state, or Australian laws. In other words, this government-funded body, Reconciliation Australia, is deceiving the Australian people about where Yunupingu's true loyalties lie. Moreover, there's long been a sustained campaign by university-based lawyers to pull the wool over the eyes of the Australian public about constitutional recognition as well. Ever since the referendum was announced by Julia Gillard in 2011, university academics have been arguing that the Australian Constitution was founded in an era of racism and is still tainted by racism. They claim the Constitution still contains racist clauses that need to be repealed by referendum. And that's their main argument for why we should all vote yes. For instance, Megan Davis, Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales, claims our founding fathers bequeathed to us a constitution that was tainted not only with racism, but also sexism and xenophobia, her words. And I'll quote her, "In determining whether to fuse separate colonies into a unified nation," Davis writes, "women, Indigenous people, Chinese and Kanaka labourers were all denied the right to vote and thus exiled from the collective, the people." Now, she wrote that in 2010, and the following year Julia Gillard appointed her to the expert panel on constitutional recognition. Yet her claims, which are in that statement, which I fully elaborate in my book, are completely false. And they only reveal Davis's complete ignorance of Australian electoral history and how democratically advanced this country was at the time of federation. Unfortunately, she's not alone. Gillard's expert panel repeated the same fiction, citing an article by Davis's colleague at the University of New South Wales, George Williams, who claimed Aborigines were denied the right to vote in the constitutional conventions of the 1890s that led to federation. However, the truth is that in the colonies of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, before federation, there were no ethnic barriers to all property qualifications for voting for Parliament, for voting for the constitutional conventions of 1897 and 1898, or for voting to approve the final draft of the Constitution itself in 1899. Megan Davis and George Williams completely misrepresent Australian electoral history. Throughout the 19th century, colonial liberals pursued the principle of what they called manhood franchise, one man, one vote, which they won in New South Wales in the Electoral Reform Act of 1858, which was some 56 years before the same rights were won in Britain in 1914. By the 1890s, Aboriginal adult males in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania had the same right to vote as everyone else. In fact, in the decade before Federation, right across rural Australia, the Aboriginal vote was a crucial factor in electing representatives to colonial parliaments. And there's plenty of evidence that Aborigines not only voted, but were courted by political parties from both the Conservative side and the Labor political movement. Had Davis or Williams bothered to read any of the parliamentary debates accompanying colonial or federal electoral bills, which was once an essential routine for proper legal scholars, they would know this. The only places where Aborigines had restricted voting rights were in the then sparsely populated colonies of Queensland and Western Australia. Each of those allowed Aborigines to vote, but only if they possessed £100 worth of property, which very few did. In the rest of Australia, all Aborigines could vote, all Aboriginal males could vote, even those who were illiterate and had no money, or even if they had no fixed address. What's more, at Federation in 1901, the Constitution granted all people who had previously been enrolled to vote in the colonies the right to vote for the Commonwealth Parliament. Section 41 of the Constitution said everyone who had the vote in the colonies before Federation, or anyone who acquired the vote in the same states after Federation, could vote for the Australian Parliament. And as the former New South Wales Premier and a Minister in the Barton government, Sir William Lyne, told the first Parliament in 1902, when it extended the vote to all women in Australia, Sir William Lyne said, "They, the Aboriginal people, the Aborigines, do vote in New South Wales. I have seen them voting. Those who now have the right cannot, under the Constitution, have that right taken away from them," unquote. Yet today, George Williams, who brags on his university website that he is one of Australia's leading constitutional lawyers and public commentators, unquote, has written, I'm quoting him again, "The founders of the Australian nation saw no place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. One of the first acts of the new Parliament was to exclude Aboriginal peoples from the franchise," unquote. That is patently untrue. Thanks to Section 41, it was constitutionally impossible for the Federal Parliament to exclude from the franchise any of the Indigenous people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia or Tasmania. During the debates in the House of Representatives and the Senate on the Commonwealth Franchise Bill of 1902, everyone who spoke in the Parliament acknowledged that this was so. Now, the reason Professors Davis and Williams perpetuate their myth is because they want to persuade the Australian people that their constitution is such a racist document it badly needs amendment. And this is a misrepresentation invented for purely political objectives, to dupe the Australian public into unwittingly conceding the demands of the Aboriginal political class. And their complaints about other constitutional sections are just as deceptive. For instance, George Williams has written that Section 25, quote, acknowledges the states can disqualify people from voting due to their race. Now, this is also completely untrue, as is obvious from the fact that racial discrimination acts in every state and the Commonwealth today would prevent such an outrageous action. And moreover, Section 25 is not about denying anyone the vote. Section 25 is there because the framers of the Constitution wanted to put pressure on Queensland and Western Australia, where, as I said, there was a property qualification for Aborigines to vote, to bring them into line with the other states where there was no such qualification. In fact, Section 25 was borrowed directly from the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States by Inglis Clark, the Tasmanian drafter of the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment, after the American Civil War, was designed to penalise those American states that still refused to enfranchise the Negroes. Our Section 25 says that if a state disqualifies any members of one race from voting, then the state cannot count any members of that race to determine its quota of representatives in the federal parliament. And this meant that at Federation, Queensland and Western Australia each lost one member from the House of Representatives it would otherwise have had if they'd given Aborigines the vote. Section 25 was never a racist clause. It was always the direct opposite. The myths spread about Section 5126 are even more outlandish. George Williams claims, and I'll quote him, Section 5126 was deliberately inserted into the Constitution to allow the Commonwealth to discriminate against sections of the community on account of their race, unquote. Yet, some of us might recall that this is the section that was amended after the famous referendum in 1967, when 90% of the Australian people voted to allow the Commonwealth the power to make laws for Aboriginal people. Before 1967, that power was reserved only for the states. And when the 1967 referendum was put to the Australian people, all the media publicity and even handout material at polling booths reproduced a joint statement by Prime Minister Harold Holt, Opposition Leader Gough Whitlam and Country Party Leader Jack McEwen that the Commonwealth would only gain the power to make laws, quote, in the best interests of Aboriginal people. However, according to George Williams and to the report of Julia Gillard's expert panel, the 90% of us who are so proud to vote yes for this amendment did the wrong thing because we deliberately put into the Constitution a clause that allows racial discrimination. The same critics claim the High Court in the 1998 case over Hindmarsh Island, which is the secret women's business court case, actually decided. These critics claim that the Hindmarsh Island case in the High Court actually decided that Section 5126 could possibly be used to disadvantage Aboriginal people. However, the truth is that the High Court did not decide any such thing. It was evenly divided on that particular issue. 2 judges for and 2 judges against. In fact, I think it was Gummo and Hayne for and Kirby and Gaudron against. And yet Aboriginal activists, including Labor's Linda Burney and Liberals' Ken Wyatt, go around writing newspaper stories, giving speeches and appear on television, repeating the myth that the High Court's failure to produce a majority judgment was actually a clear-cut decision, that the Constitution, quote, even has sections that allow discrimination based on race. In fact, this has now become the central argument the Aboriginal political class makes to generate support for a constitutional amendment. 2 members of Gillard's expert panel, Megan Davis and Marcia Langton, have said the question they want to put to the Australian public is, quote, do you want to remove racist provisions from our Constitution? And if the public fail to approve, they say, quoting them again, this loss would brand Australians to the world as racists. Now this is clearly ethnic blackmail. Vote for us or we will trash your country's international reputation. The claim that the Australian Constitution ever had, let alone continues to have, racist provisions is false. The central argument in the campaign for constitutional recognition is bogus. No voter in any referendum should believe it. If this proposed constitutional referendum goes ahead, those of us opposed to recognition should join ranks to mount a nationwide campaign to point this out and to put the case why the Australian people should vote no. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I neglected, and I'm sorry, to introduce Keith. If you don't know, he's an Australian writer, historian, former ABC board member and editor, then editor-in-chief of Quadrant. I have a list of his 10 other books, but there won't be time to read them. From the right of the panel is Kerryn Pholi, who writes for The Spectator and for Recognize What? RecognizeWhat.org.au, a forum that aims to better inform the debate over Aboriginal reconciliation in the Australian Constitution. Then we come to Rowan Dean, who is a columnist on national newspapers, a commentator on Sky News, and the very successful editor of Spectator Australia. And then we have Shireen Morris. She's a senior policy advisor and constitutional reform research fellow at Cape York Institute and a PhD candidate at Monash University and co-editor of a recent book, The Forgotten People. And if you Google The Australian, go to last weekend's edition where you will find Shireen making comments on this matter. And then we have Damien Freeman. Damien Freeman, who's well known in ACM circles, studied law, philosophy and classical Hebrew and Aramaic at the University of Sydney and Magdalen College, Cambridge. In 2011 he published Art's Emotions, Ethics, Expression and Aesthetic Experience. He too is the co-editor with Shireen of The Forgotten People. He's also published widely in the Australian Bar Review, Public Law Review, Constitutional Law and Policy Review, Harvard Review of Philosophy, the Journal of Aesthetic Education and Literature and Aesthetics. He currently teaches ethics and aesthetics at Pembroke College, Cambridge. So we have a superb panel, and I would like to begin by asking Shireen if you wish to make a comment.
Hi everyone, thank you. I'm very honoured to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Professor Flint. Look, I think that this has been a little bit of a wasted opportunity. Sorry. A little bit of a wasted opportunity, which I'm a bit disappointed about. I think Mr. Windschuttle's talk does a very good job of addressing some leftist progressive arguments for Indigenous rights and recognition. But I think what you're not being presented is there is a deeply conservative case for constitutional recognition, which we at Cape York Institute have worked very hard on developing. So yes, there are writers who, like George Williams and others, who approach the issue in a certain way, but there are many other scholars, many respected constitutionally conservative scholars, who approach the issue in a way that I think that ACM, as Abbott described the fiercest defenders of the Constitution, would find very intellectually interesting. So I just want to quickly make that conservative case for you. And one way to think about the problem that we're trying to solve here is that there is a long history of tradition of the Crown holding very honourable intentions towards the Indigenous peoples in its colonies. And this was reflected back in Captain Cook's time and Arthur Phillip's time, when they carried dignified royal instructions from the Crown. And these royal instructions said that they should treat the natives, as they were referred to back then, with amity and kindness. So there is a basic level of decency and moral virtue embedded in the way monarchists and constitutional conservatives approach things. Now, unfortunately, as the politics of settlement played out, those promises weren't fulfilled as well as they should have been. I think we can all agree on that. And in a way, that those unfulfilled promises were also reflected in the way that the Constitution was established. I disagree with Mr. Windschuttle. I do think that there was discrimination. I think that is absolutely evident in the text of the Constitution. Some of it was removed in 1967, not all of it, but it is also evident on the law books, on the record of the law books. So I think that constitutional recognition aims to fulfil those unfulfilled promises of the Crown, to implement some fairer constitutional rules to ensure that the relationship between Indigenous people and the Crown is fairer and more dignified and more honourable than it's been in the past. And I think that there is a way of doing that. There is a way of implementing some fairer rules that is constitutionally conservative. And that is the key thing. There is a way of doing it that avoids unintended consequences that Mr. Windschuttle is worried about, and there is a way of doing it that upholds and respects the Constitution. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And going around the panel, I'll ask Kerryn if you wish to comment at this stage. You don't have to.
Well, I was going to ask Shireen if she had an example of if it is so clear-cut, how come it's been so... Sorry, if it is so clear-cut, how come it's still been so difficult to come up with a proposal? And I should say that our organisation Recognize what? It is literally that. It's not a no, because nothing has been presented as yet for us to say yes or no to. And that's why we're raising concerns about risk, but we also have concerns about the way this is being conducted, this debate. We feel that there's a lot of claims here that are pretty disingenuous. That's part of my capacity of being here, and to don my identity hat, if you like. Aboriginal people are pretty straight-talking people, so I don't really like being represented in these disingenuous and dubious sort of ways. If Aboriginal people want certain things in the Constitution, if Aboriginal people want a treaty, or if this is a means to a treaty, step up and say so. Don't try to reverse engineer it into the Australian Constitution. Don't try to pull the wool over the Australian public's eyes. Don't try to get away with something and hopefully the voting public won't notice what it is that you're really asking for. Step up and ask for it. You know, I think to me that's more our way. So that's the first capacity, I suppose, in which I'm here. Another capacity in which I'm here is, I guess, I'm what Peter Fitzsimon's referred to as a nervous Nelly, or I guess in these gender fluid times I could be a Nettie naysayer as well. I think I don't really appreciate being laughed at for being concerned about the Constitution, just as anyone else, as all of you people in the room are. And just because I'm a person of Aboriginal descent, I still have that right, or just as much right as anyone else, to go, well, hang on, what are the risks around this? And there are some real risks in the different forms of recognition in the Constitution that have already been put forward. I don't want to take up too much of the time, but I just want to raise a couple. The first is that any recognition of Aboriginal culture within the Constitution, it creates risks for the most vulnerable people within that culture. The constitutions of nations such as diverse as Singapore, Mexico, Kenya and Rwanda, for example, they acknowledge Indigenous traditional rights within that constitution, but they make it clear that such rights are subservient to the broader human rights of women and the elderly, the disabled, because they recognise in some of these countries, through a lot of pain and suffering, recognise that they are the most vulnerable within these cultures. Now, we don't have a Bill of Rights and we do well enough without one, but the proposal for Aboriginal recognition potentially introduces a one-clause Bill of Rights, which could form the basis of a legal defence for abuse and corruption within Aboriginal communities as a cultural practice or right. So rather than setting Aboriginal people free, recognition of Aboriginal culture within the Constitution without any very firm caveats around that may further entrap and marginalise the most vulnerable Aboriginal people. That's just one of the risks that I wanted to talk about. There are others, but perhaps that's something that the rest of the panel might like to comment on.
Before we go to that, could I ask Damien to comment? You proposed...
Well, I think actually, as that was asked as a question to Shireen.
Yes, it was indeed, but I would like to ask you.
I prefer to let Shireen respond.
Yes, but I want to ask you about the declaration. You proposed, Damien, you proposed a declaration with Julie and Lisa. How does that fit in with constitutional change? When I first read it, I thought this is an alternative to constitutional change. Is it linked to constitutional change?
Well, we put that forward as a suggestion. Of course, it's now been taken up by some people who've seen the merit in it and who've seen it as possibly being part of a package of changes, which Shireen might like to talk about in response to Kerryn. And it is, I suppose, an attempt to find a way of dealing with the issues around symbolism without inserting those words into the Constitution, that if you think there's a need for some kind of symbolic language at the national level, this might be a way of doing it without putting it in the Constitution. And the effect of that is you would avoid the problems that come from giving that to, putting that within the jurisdiction of the High Court, where if it's in the Constitution, there's no way around the fact it's going to be interpreted by the High Court. Our suggestion was we could have a national document, a document that had cultural significance, not unlike the kind of cultural significance that the Declaration of Independence has in America, that the Declaration of Independence is not part of the Constitution, therefore it's not claim to have constitutional significance, but that doesn't undermine the fact that it can still have cultural significance, and that if you're looking for some way of finding symbolic language at a national level that would fulfil a cultural need, that might be a way of doing it without inserting the words in the Constitution, and therefore avoiding the sorts of problems that would happen if you leave it for the High Court to interpret.
Thank you, Damien. Shireen, did you want to make a general response?
Yeah, I'll try and quickly answer Kerryn's question. Kerryn, there's nothing that you said that I disagree with at all. I think each of us has a responsibility to be nervous about changing the Constitution. We have a responsibility to uphold and protect the Constitution, because I agree with people like Damien and Julian, Lisa and many others that we have one of the greatest constitutions in the world, right? It's presided over a prosperous and stable democracy, and it's worked very well to set up a very cohesive and peaceful society for the most of us. I do, however, think that we can do better in the area of the treatment of Indigenous peoples, as I said. But I think the reason it's hard to come up with a proposal is for the very sensible reasons that Kerryn has raised, right? So when the expert panel proposed its recommendations for reform, there was a racial non-discrimination clause in there. As Kerryn says, it was described as a one-clause Bill of Rights. Kerryn also correctly identifies that if you insert words like culture, heritage, symbolic statements into the Constitution, then it opens up the possibility for unintended legal consequences. Now, when I talk about our conservative approach to constitutional recognition, it involved going to constitutional conservatives and talking to them about their rational concerns. You know, talking to them about, okay, we are hearing what you are saying, that it's not good to put a one-clause Bill of Rights in there. What's a better way of addressing this issue? We heard their concerns about the problems with inserting symbolic statements into the Constitution. That is why we were persuaded by Julian and Damien's very good idea of having a declaration outside the Constitution, completely free of legal consequences and potentially containing much more in the way of inspiring poetry. In terms of the amendment within the Constitution, what we propose is a very modest, practical, not symbolic amendment devised with people like Professor Greg Craven, Julian Lisa, Damien, Professor Anne Toomey, to guarantee that Indigenous people have a voice when Parliament makes laws and policies about them, a non-binding voice. And I think, together, that proposal creates a very dignified and deeply conservative solution to the problem that we're trying to solve.
Thank you, Shireen. Before Keith Windschuttle makes a comment, and then we'll go to questions, I would like to ask Rowan for a comment, but I would like him in particular to comment on two matters. One is the proposal to establish under the Constitution a body, an elected body, which would represent the Aboriginal people, which would presumably comment, but have no authority, comment on matters relevant to the Aboriginal people. The second matter is the phenomenon we are seeing, not only in relation to this, but also in relation to the same-sex marriage debate, of corporations taking a position and advertising in relation to the constitutional proposal and suggesting that people should vote one way or the other. Right.
There's a lot there, David, but this is all far too polite. You'll never get a job on Sky, any of you. Come on, let's ramp it up a bit. I'll get to those two subjects, David, but the Recognize campaign has a nice logo with a big R on it for recognition, but in fact the real R word, which is at the heart of this entire debate, and which you've all been too nice to mention, is racism. And the problem is with the entire recognition movement, as Kerryn pointed out, recognise what? We still don't know. But more importantly, any opposition to any suggestions put forward are coloured by this idea or viewed as racist. So if you make a criticism of some idea being put forward by the Recognise movement, no, that's racist, you can't do that. And we've seen already, as Keith referred to, the idea that if Australians don't vote for recognition, then, by definition, Australians are racists. So you have the two R words in complete opposition, but only one side can use the R word, and that's the Indigenous community can point at anything that the non-Indigenous community say and say, your criticism or your reluctance is racism. It never works the other way. And we've seen how dangerous this is in the last few days, in the last few months, obviously with AT&C, with the QUT students, 3 white kids who criticise what was racist behaviour, not allowing them into a black-only area, and they were called racists. Not only that, not only were they called racists, they legally may well be found to be racist, and it might cost them not only their careers but an awful lot of money. Yet they weren't allowed to point the finger at the Indigenous woman and say, you're being racist. because that's racist. So go figure. So unless you're prepared to confront the word racism and really drill down to what it's about, and Shireen's comments, the debate between Shireen and Keith to do with what is in the Constitution at the moment is all to do with the semantics of the word race and what was meant by those terms race. So Shireen sees it as the Constitution being a racist document, and she's perfectly entitled to view it that way, and Keith sees it as being a benefactor or a kind of paternal document in some ways, and he's perfectly entitled to see it that way. But the Australian people will not tolerate being called racists, and so the idea that we must change the Constitution or else we are racists is never going to get through. So to the question that David asked about, and I think Damien's idea, and I think I loved it when Noel Pearson and Damien and I think Julie and Lisa first put it forward, the idea of some kind of lovely document, terrific, beautiful language, culturally wonderful, says all the right things, but it is not a legal document. It is there for cultural purposes. And it strikes me that that gets to the real heart of the issue, because what really I think Shireen and all the recognised movement, all those who don't want sovereignty but are genuinely looking for a better way forward, what they are looking for is a cultural acknowledgement that there were the first Indigenous First Peoples, and they want that kind of recognised. If you make it a legal thing, you then automatically fall into this trap of any opposition or criticism of it as racism, and I think that's really dangerous. Back to your other point, David, about a separate body, and this is where I immediately disagreed with Noel Pearson, a separate body advising the government on, or anybody, on Indigenous affairs. We've had hundreds of those, and either they're not listened to, or they head off into obscure different ideas of their own, or the money is wasted, whatever. There is no one Indigenous, I'm sorry, Shireen, there's not one Indigenous culture. They are all individual people. Indigenous Australians are individual people. And they are no different to me or you or anyone. They are individuals, Australians, who all must have exactly the same equality under the law. The moment you start saying, well, actually, we happen to, because my great-granddad was Indigenous, I happen to be entitled to a different point of view, or I have a different culture that you don't understand because, in some way I'm special. I'm sorry, that's not reality in my point of view.
Keith, did you wish to make a comment before we go to questions?
Thanks, David. Just on the question of, I don't know if everyone here, I presume most of you probably haven't read Damien's proposal for a declaration, which as Rowan said, is full of very generous and worthy sentiments, which would be very nice. I mean, I think it probably would, everyone would say, yes, we'll do that, and it would probably languish, because we hear those sort of nice sentiments about respecting Aboriginal culture all the time. But if all we're doing when we're changing the Constitution through a referendum is recognising people being respectful and all the rest, well, we already do that. All the constitutions of several of the existing states have recognition clauses in them. There are bills in states, and there's a bill in the Commonwealth passed by Julia Gillard in 2013. It was called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Recognition Bill, and it's got virtually the whole package that people want in constitutions. They were here first. They love their country. They have a traditional ancient culture, which does nice things for everybody. That's all in Julia Gillard's bill, which became law. So why do they want to go on and put it in the Constitution? Well, the reason, I'm afraid, is because if it's in the Constitution, then it's there for good, at least for a century. No one's going to... There's no prospect of taking out a constitutional recognition clause in the Constitution once it's there, because if you remember after Mabo, John Howard, and after the Wick decision by the High Court, John Howard came in and said, well, we're going to change the law, which the Parliament can do, to make the Wick provisions less onerous, and he did. So it means that if something is enshrined in law, it can be changed, but if it's enshrined in the Constitution, it cannot be changed. And that means that that the power of one particular ethnic minority group would be far more advanced than any other particular ethnic minority group. They would have special provisions that apply only to them. Shireen said that in 1967 the Constitution took out, the referendum took out some racist provisions. It actually didn't. The Constitution said that the particular clause that was changed in 1967 said the Commonwealth has the power to make laws for people of any race, except for Aboriginal people, because that was a state responsibility. It had traditionally been a state job. And at Federation, the Commonwealth was more looking at national issues rather than domestic social policy. And so it said the states will continue to have special laws for Aboriginal people, knowing that Aboriginal people were in a transition from hunter-gatherer status, certainly in the north of the country, transitioned from hunter-gatherer status to living in a modern economy that the rest of the country was governed by. So the recognition issue is already there. We have 9 different human rights commissions in Australia to police these things. You think 9? Where are the 9? Well, there's human rights and equal opportunity bureaucracies in all 6 states, plus the Commonwealth and plus the ACT. The ACT has, I think, 4 commissioners and a staff of 23 to police the human rights abuses that occur in the 300,000 people who live in Canberra. We are grossly overgoverned in terms of human rights provisions, both in our laws so there is another agenda for constitutional change, and that is to give power to the Aboriginal political class. If you had a separate Aboriginal parliament advising the Commonwealth Parliament, and it had constitutional force, the country would very quickly become ungovernable, because there is an agenda at the moment between the Greens and number of key landholders in the country to stop 2 particular industries, the coal industry and the cattle industry. And if you read the newspapers every day, you'll see that John Podesta, who's one of Hillary Clinton's prime advisors and will be very powerful if and when she wins the presidential election, he's been working with some of the native title holders that surround the Adani coal mine, trying to stop the Adani coal mine, trying to interfere in sovereign Australian business, and using native title as a lever. And in the Northern Territory, in northwestern and Western Australia, the aim of the Greens is to use native title holders to close down both mining and the cattle industry. You'll recall that the James Price Point LPG gas hub, which was going to be one of the world's biggest gas hubs, it was withdrawn, partly because of the dissension amongst the native title holders, aided and abetted by Murray Wilcox. Murray Wilcox was a federal court judge, you might remember, who gave Perth to the Aborigines. And literally, he gave Perth under a native title decision to the Aborigines. It was only reversed on appeal to the full bench of the federal court. Murray Wilcox, people I know called him Mad Murray Wilcox. He was there demonstrating at James Price Point near Broome against the LPG gas hub, and it was effective. They stopped one of the world's biggest energy mining projects from coming to fruition. They're trying to stop Adani, and there's a whole lot of concern today about the Chinese buying the Kidman Empire. Well, let me tell you, the Kidman Empire has already been divided up by the Greens. So far, they've taken out 2 of the runs, the Mornington Run and the Marion Downs Run, and you can see this on the website of Australian Native Conservation. It's not conservation, but it's a word like that. Conservancy. Thank you. You can see that they've taken out 600,000 square kilometres of land from the cattle industry and said it needs a rest. It should be needs to recover, or the grasses should grow, and without cattle eating it.
Yes.
In other words, it's a
Keith,
private sector. It's a private NGO national park. That's what it's been changed into.
Good, thank you, Keith. That's interesting. Now, we have time for a few questions. I think Jai has afternoon tea about to arrive, or is it about to arrive? But we started late, didn't we? So can we go a little over? We'll go a little over. And are there any questions? Yes, there's a question. Questions over there. If you'd wait for the microphone.
Question is coming from comparative history of England. First, inhabitants are builders of megalithic structure in England. Stonehenge is example. After that, we got Celtic invasion. After Celts, we got Roman invasion. Then we got Anglo-Saxon invasion. Then we got Vikings. And Vikings from France, which learned French under William the Conqueror. Did anybody ever bother to go in current state of British land laws and entitlement? Are we mad? Why are we not comparing land laws in England under constitution of which we are part ourselves, and then accuse them of gross abuse? I mentioned just one scientific fact. Around the Stonehenge, there was excavations on which been several experts in genetics, which found 2 skeletons in the cave. Those skeletons been in good enough state to draw genetic code out. They then go to the school of 600 children and ask principal, would he kindly participate in genetical tests of these skeletons? Kids have to get just one pinprick of the blood from their finger. But they discover that 70% of locals are directly related to them.
Well, thank you. That's an interesting comment, and I think it raises both legal and philosophical questions, and I'm going to ask Damien. Damien, you're the lawyer and philosopher. Do you wish to comment?
Well, as I didn't get to make a general comment before, I'd sort of start by saying it's quite some time since I've been to an ACM event, and I look out here and I'm very pleased to see old friends I used to work with, Gomer and Don and Elaine and Doug I saw before, and Lloyd Waddy I see over there, and it's rather nice to see you again. Because it's been quite a long time. Look, the best explanation I can give you of why this might be different from the situation you describe is to say my starting point is different from your starting point. My starting point is also different from Keith Windschuttle's starting point. I don't start with what these Aboriginal activists want. I don't start with what happened in England over that long period of time. I start with the fact that Tony Abbott wanted to make good something that had started with John Howard, and that he was committed to trying to find a way of doing this. And I and Julie and Lisa, as people who had dedicated our youth to upholding the Constitution here with ACM, were mindful that we, on the one hand, wouldn't like to find ourselves opposing what Tony Abbott was trying to do, but on the other hand, we weren't going to give in to something that we felt undermined the integrity of the Constitution. Now, Tony Abbott genuinely believed, as he said to me, he said, I believe that anyone of goodwill will support what we're trying to do here. He said, unfortunately, not everyone has goodwill, but he said, I believe the people who have goodwill will support this. And look, I think what he was trying to do, it was not something that I personally saw the good in. It was not something that I would personally have put my time behind, but I see what he was on about, and he's right. This goes back to the royal instructions that tell us that we should treat these people with amity and kindness. And the question then is, either you want to follow Tony Abbott's leadership and find a conservative way of doing this, or you're going to be a reactionary and just be opposed to change. And, you know, leadership has now been offered in both directions here, and you can follow the reactionaries, and that, you know, that's your right if you want to be opposed to change. I think on this, Tony Abbott is being a Burkean. I think he's looking for what is the cautious change, what is the gradual change, what is the change for which there's a good reason. And you know, on this, I think he's right to be taking the Burkean approach. Remember, Burke was opposed to the French Revolution because it was a sudden change, an abrupt change, a change for which he didn't perceive there to be good reason. Nevertheless, Burke himself was supportive of giving independence to the American colonies, to Home Rule for Ireland, to reforming the situation in India, to the abolition of slavery. He was someone who sets out for us what it is to be conservative, and who saw that what it meant to be conservative was to be cautious about change, was to resist sudden change, but was also to see that sometimes change is desirable and that we need to find the best, most cautious way of doing it. Now, that's what Julian, Lisa and I have been trying to do on this. We've been trying to say, well, look, John Howard and Tony Abbott were committed to this. They may not have articulated the best way of doing it, but let's try and find a way that avoids the unintended consequences. Let's try and avoid vaguely worded amendments to the Constitution. I'll fight against vaguely worded amendments to the Constitution too. I'm not going to support that. Let's avoid a situation that results in the Australian people being duped. But I believe that what Tony Abbott was looking for in succession to John Howard was to say there may be a way of doing this that would uphold the integrity of the Constitution. And I can only say to you, I think if you're a conservative rather than a reactionary, you'll see that trying to follow the leadership offered by Tony Abbott on this is the right approach.
Thank you,
I
Damien.
accept that some people are reactionaries and are going to be opposed to change.
Thank you,
and that's their
Damien.
prerogative.
Edward Selwyn.
Sorry, I've got a question. Professor.
Oh, sorry. Look, just a moment. You'll be next, Edward, and the microphone is up there, I think.
Hi, I'm Phil. We keep talking about the Constitution, but what I'm worried about is our politicians signed an agreement with United Nations, say, 10 to 15 years ago, about the Indigenous people having this rights all over the world. Does that make our Indigenous people got their own United Nations charter, but they're all supposed to be equal in Australia? How can they be equal if they've got another set of rights signed by the United Nations where we don't go through the Constitution, we go through a politician can go and sign some agreement overseas?
As I understand it, once the Commonwealth, and Damien may correct me, once the Commonwealth enters into a treaty, it gives the Commonwealth power to legislate with respect to that area and to give effect to that treaty under the external affairs power. That is the current jurisprudence of the High Court, and I think there's an agreement on that.
Well, actually, David, we didn't sign an agreement with that. Kevin Rudd had a ceremony in Parliament House saying, yes, we agree with, we think this is a fine document, but we didn't formally ratify it. It's not been incorporated into Australian law, and that wasn't really the intention, because in most countries of the world that have Indigenous people, there was strenuous objections about putting the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights into their domestic law. One of the reasons for that is that this UN Declaration of Human Rights was written largely by two Australians, Mick Dodson and Megan Davis. And let me tell you, Megan Davis now sits on a United Nations conference, ongoing conference. She's the permanent chair of a UN advisory body on Indigenous rights. And what she does is she invites Australian Aboriginal activists to go over to the UN and to address her conference on a regular basis. The most recent one who did this was Jackie Huggins, and Jackie Huggins went over there and presented a paper saying that the Howard government intervention in 2007 breached all Indigenous rights because, I mean, shock horror, it went in and it took it provided welfare cards instead of cash to Aboriginal males so they could spend it on booze instead of on their families. It approved alcohol restrictions and it arrested a number of the elders of several remote communities and put them in jail for having sex with children. And it did all that without asking the permission of the Aboriginal political class whether it could do it. It didn't go through a self-determination process. It just decided this was the right thing to do under Australian law, and it did it. Now, that is now being held up as a crime against Indigenous people in the UN. And there's a stream of people who get flown over, best seats in the plane, and put up in New York, and they trash Australia's reputation before this international forum. And the aim of that is to build a case against Australia that will eventually go before the UN's International Court of Justice and to put us in the same status that South Africa was in before the old regime fell.
Thank you, Keith. Now, Edward.
Thank you, Professor.
And I'll leave the handling of the microphone to my friend over there. You decide where to give it, because otherwise we'll conflict with one another, and we really have to finish in about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Professor. I was interested in Shireen saying that our Constitution is a pretty good document, and I believe it's a good document because it's a bare bones document. There's very little in it, and it's the conventions surrounding the Constitution that make it work. It expands or extracts as we need it. In a way, I'm sort of supporting what Keith Windschuttle has said. We don't need a formal alteration in the Constitution because the Constitution and its conventions can cover that. And I'm a bit concerned how we can look at the values of 150 years ago from 2016 eyes. I don't think it's valid because Australia was a different country in 1890. It was a very different country. We're all learning a lot about how we should deal with our issues, but I'm just a little bit concerned that we're using a funny mechanism of getting there.
Thank you. That's a comment, and yes.
Sorry, can I answer that
yes, certainly,
question?
If you wish to.
You're right. I did say that we've got a very good constitution, and I was very interested in how Rowan Dean completely misheard me saying that and kind of said that I said we had a racist constitution. But I didn't say that we had a racist constitution, as you rightly point out. I said we have a very good constitution, one of the best in the world. However, I think in response to what you're saying is that I do think from a 2016 perspective, I think we can do better. I think particularly, we spend billions of dollars in Indigenous affairs and we are not getting the outcomes that we should be getting for that kind of expenditure. And one of the reasons Julian Leeser, and I think he speaks very persuasively on this issue, is that we need to be making better policies and more efficient and more productive policies. And I completely agree with you that one of the reasons our Constitution is so good is that it is a bare bones document. And what I and Noel Pearson have been working so hard with, together with constitutional conservatives, is to find a way of making better policy in Indigenous affairs in a way that is in keeping with the nature and the culture of our Constitution. And when Julian Leeser talks about our proposed amendment that he helped draft, by the way, he says, you talked about looking back on history with 2016 eyes. Well, he very poignantly says that kind of amendment that we've been working on is something that Griffith, Barton and others might have drafted themselves if they had turned their minds to it, if they had thought differently about the position of Indigenous people within Australia.
Yes, certainly, and Rowan will comment, and then we have one more question.
Sorry, Shireen, if I misrepresented your position, I didn't mean to apologise for that. What I'm saying is that the recognition movement's desire to amend the Constitution as opposed to other ideas focuses on the word race and whether it is racist or not. But I didn't mean to misrepresent you. But the one thing I will say, we do spend an awful lot of time in Australia discussing this issue and very little time discussing how to improve the actual lives of Aborigines through jobs and allowing them to buy their own property so they have a stake in their own future. And that is what is missing, not airy-fairy things in constitutional documents.
Can I just say,
and then the question.
It's interesting that you say that because I probably qualify as a reactionary. But unlike many people, I actually used to be a lawyer at the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, and I've seen firsthand some stuff that was very upsetting. And, you know, I guess this is what happens as you get older. You see fashionable human rights issues. And I'm sorry, Shireen, but you do a lot of talking, but it's very ethereal. And I think what probably matters to most Aboriginal people is health, education, and improving the statistics of the rate of imprisonment and so on and so forth. In decades of watching billions of dollars being squandered on recognition and twisted campaigns about, you know, stolen children and all the rest of it, I really think it's about time that Aboriginal people actually owned up, or had a chance to own up through if they could get through the human rights industry and actually make it clear to people how they can help. Because I think there is actually a massive amount of goodwill towards Aboriginal people in this country, far more goodwill towards them than towards asylum seekers and a whole host of other so-called minorities. But while people are casting themselves as minorities and using the human rights jargon and asking to be recognised in our constitution, which I think is going to be very unpopular because a lot of people will see it as divisive, we're not going to actually get runs on the board and concrete improvements for Aboriginal people.
And Kerryn will have the last word because we are really running out of time. I'm sorry about that. Kerryn.
It's that last comment is a hard act to follow because I agree 100%. Sorry. So yeah, I guess advocates for recognition will often point to Aboriginal inequality and disadvantage as evidence in itself that the Constitution needs to change. But my response to that would be, like, if there were clauses or omissions within the Constitution that are specifically contributing to Aboriginal disadvantage, because there are other people in Australia that are disadvantaged, not just Aboriginal people, but so what is it within the Constitution that specifically affects Aboriginal people and causes that disadvantage? If that is the case, it should be pretty easy to identify what that problem is in the Constitution and to propose a feasible solution. Yet the recognition campaign, as we've seen, struggles to present a coherent case for change because the change that is needed does not reside within the Constitution. It's within political will to make those changes, to not be afraid of being called racist, all of those things. You're not going to find those solutions within the Constitution, and I actually think it is very unfair to Aboriginal people to keep on telling them that this is where your salvation lies.
And on that point we must close, and I must thank, on your behalf, Damien, Keith, Shireen, Kerryn and Rowan for their marvellous contributions. I wish we'd had more time. We should have had more time, but that closes this session.